Nancy's voice drifts through the room, playful and soft, coaxing a response from her toddler. Laughter follows. Ordinary sounds. A young family captured in a quiet, intimate moment. 18-month-old Devender, his baby brother Ravinder, and their parents appeared to be living a life most people would envy. Anil Chauhan was a successful businessman. Nancy, his wife, was warm and devoted. Together, they were raising two small children in what looked like a stable, loving home. But in February of 2003, just 2 days after that home video was recorded, every trace of that life vanished. All 5 members of the Chauhan family disappeared. No goodbyes, no explanation, no sign of where they had gone. Police were confronted with a mystery that defied logic. 3 generations of the same family gone at once. Friends and neighbors struggled to understand how a family with no visible problems could simply walk away from everything. At first, investigators considered the unthinkable, that the Chauhans had chosen to vanish. But as the search widened, fragments of evidence began to surface, clues that suggested movement, planning, and something far darker beneath the surface. This would become the story of a man capable of making an entire family disappear. Behind it all was an extraordinary deception engineered by someone willing to cross any line for money. A crime so calculated, so disturbing, that even seasoned detectives hesitated to believe it had actually happened. In 2003, Anil Chauhan ran a successful fruit importation business based near Heathrow Airport. The company, Sieba Freight, was busy and profitable. To his employees, Anil was approachable, generous, and deeply involved in daily operations. He wasn't a distant executive. When work piled up, he stayed late. He bought food for his staff. The atmosphere felt less like a workplace and more like an extended family. But success brought visibility, and visibility brought risk. In January of that year, a man newly released from prison arrived at Sieba Freight looking for a job. His name was Kenneth Regan. Regan presented himself as someone trying to rebuild his life. He spoke of wanting to go straight, of leaving his past behind. And Anil Chauhan listened. Anil knew what it meant to be judged by a criminal record. He had served time himself for tax-related offenses and believed strongly in second chances, sometimes more than one. It was that instinct, his trust, his empathy, that would quietly open the door to the person who would soon change everything. And at the time, no one inside that warehouse could have imagined what had just walked in. If Anil could believe in second chances, Regan knew he wouldn't be alone. On the surface, Ken Regan worked hard. He drove deliveries. He didn't shy away from physical labor. To those around him, he looked like a reliable employee doing his job. But Kenneth Regan was no ordinary driver. 5 years earlier, he had lived a very different life. In the late 1990s, Regan was a seasoned drug smuggler, known in criminal circles by a nickname that followed him everywhere, Captain Cash. He had set up freight companies around Heathrow, using them as cover to move drugs into the country. He knew major criminal figures across London. He spent freely. He lived fast. And for a time, he thrived. It was during that period that Regan crossed paths with Belinda Bruin, a well-connected socialite and celebrity agent. They met in a fashionable London bar, two people from very different worlds. To Belinda, Regan came across as rough around the edges but confident. Well-dressed, flashy watch, always spending money. The kind of man who wanted to project success whether it was earned or not. He carried cash everywhere. Thick bundles of high-denomination notes, sometimes even a briefcase full of it. To him, money was status, proof that he mattered. Belinda would later realize she had been drawn without meaning to into Regan's orbit. What began as attention soon turned into fixation. He contacted her repeatedly. Calls, emails, messages that felt intense and unsettling, especially given how little they truly knew each other. And then came something more disturbing: Regan telling others that Belinda was his girlfriend when she had never agreed to anything of the sort. Before that tension could fully surface, Regan disappeared again. On June 17, 1998, he was arrested with 25 kilograms of heroin. Facing a possible 18-year sentence, Regan made a calculated decision. He cooperated. His information led to the conviction of a dozen major criminals. In return, his own sentence was dramatically reduced. When Regan walked free 4 years later, the glamour was gone. His assets had been seized. His criminal allies wanted nothing to do with him. He was back living in a small bungalow with his father, angry, broke, and sidelined. But the ambition hadn't disappeared. Reagan wanted back in. And when he looked at Anil Chauhan's freight company, he saw the perfect vehicle. What followed wasn't a robbery or a hostile takeover. It was something far colder. Reagan began laying a trap. Not long after joining Cyber Freight, he approached Anil with a proposal. He claimed to know investors interested in buying the company. The figure he floated, £3 million, was carefully chosen. It was enough to make Anil think, enough to align with conversations already happening at home. Nancy had spoken often about returning to India, about retiring, about giving their children a different future. While Anil considered the offer, Reagan quietly moved on to the next phase of his plan. The company wasn't the only thing he intended to take control of. Around the same time, Belinda Bruin had left London behind, moving to a rural property in Devon. During Regan's years in prison, the obsessive contact had stopped. But now, newly released, he reached out again. This time he framed it as business. Belinda was vulnerable. Financial pressure, 2 children, a large mortgage, her personal life in upheaval. When Reagan suggested an opportunity, she listened. He told her he planned to take over Cyber Freight and needed a managing director. The salary he offered was extraordinary, especially for someone with no experience in freight or logistics. At first it sounded too good to be true, and yet Reagan kept increasing the offer until it crossed into territory that felt impossible to ignore. The job gave him a reason to visit her isolated home, repeatedly, often for trivial paperwork, small excuses that justified long drives and short meetings. And slowly something else became clear. Reagan wasn't just interested in Belinda or the company. He seemed increasingly fixated on the land itself, on the farm, on the narrow, muddy lane that led to it. At the time, it felt like nothing more than an odd detail. Later, it would feel very different. Reagan talked about transforming the place, cutting trees, putting up walls, electric gates. He spoke as if the farmhouse were a project waiting for his approval, not someone else's home. He criticized the land, the mud, the lane, said it was disgusting, said he could make it beautiful. What it really sounded like was ownership spoken aloud, before it had been earned. By February, Anil Chauhan had made his decision. He agreed to meet the investors Reagan claimed were ready to buy his company. On the Thursday morning before Valentine's Day, Anil left his office telling staff he had a meeting near Stonehenge. He said he was going to sell the business. He said he'd be in touch. No one at Cyber Freight ever saw him again. The following Monday morning, the staff arrived to an announcement none of them were prepared for. Ken Reagan stood before them and introduced Belinda Bruin as the new owner of the company. There was confusion, shock, anxiety. Employees whispered questions to each other. Where had Anil gone? Was the sale real? What would happen to their jobs? Reagan produced a letter. It explained that Anil had sold the company and retired abroad with Nancy due to ill health. The letter carried Anil Chauhan's signature. Work didn't stop. It couldn't. The business was too busy. Whatever doubts people had were pushed aside by deadlines and deliveries. Belinda was given a desk and a computer and told to start reviewing the company's accounts. But on her second day, she felt unwell. Instead of driving to Cyber Freight where Reagan was expecting her, she returned to her home in Devon. When she pulled into her driveway, something felt immediately wrong. An old battered Jaguar sat outside. 2 men were in her field, operating a digger. They were friends of Ken Reagan. Belinda was furious. She demanded to know what they were doing on her land. The explanation she was given sounded absurd. They said they were building her a drainage ditch. A wide trench had already been cut through the field, running along the hedge. No permission. No warning. Just excavation. When Reagan arrived, Belinda confronted him. This wasn't about whether the land needed drainage. It was about control. About someone deciding, without asking, to dig up her property. Reagan brushed it off. Said he thought she'd appreciate it. She didn't. The field looked ruined. She intended to have it filled back in. She never got the chance. In 2003, Kenneth Reagan was close to reclaiming the life he believed he deserved. Anil Chauhan had vanished. Reagan now controlled a bonded warehouse perfect cover for illegal imports. And Belinda Bruin, the woman he'd obsessed over for years, was on his payroll. From the outside, it looked like everything had fallen into place. But the truth behind his sudden success was already beginning to unravel. Nearly 12,000 miles away in New Zealand, a journalist named Onkar Verma was preparing for a long-awaited trip. Nancy Chauhan was his sister. He hadn't seen her in 9 years. He was finally coming to England to reunite with her family. Then on February 15th, the phone call stopped. Nancy didn't answer. Neither did their mother. Something felt wrong. Onkar contacted the Metropolitan Police. A routine check confirmed the family home was empty. Friends and colleagues believed the Chauhans had gone to India. At first, there was no sign of a crime. People are allowed to leave, police explained. It was possible the family had simply relocated. Onkar wasn't convinced. If no one else was going to look for his family, he would. Alone, in a country he had never visited before, Onkar Verma flew to Britain. And when he arrived at the house in Hounslow, what he found there would change everything. Onkar stepped inside the house and felt it immediately. Children's toys were scattered across the floor. Baby bottles sat where they'd last been used. Clothes were still folded away. In the fridge, uncooked food waited, untouched. Nothing about the house suggested a family preparing to leave. Then he saw something that made his stomach drop. His mother's prayer book was still there. It was the one thing she never went anywhere without. To Onkar, its presence said more than anything else in the room ever could. This wasn't a planned departure. He couldn't make sense of it. 2 adults, 2 small children, an elderly parent, vanishing without a word, without a call, without telling him. Onkar returned to the police and pushed harder. This time, he convinced them that his family hadn't chosen to disappear. A full investigation was launched. Detective Chief Inspector Andy Rowell began by speaking to the last known person to see Anil Chauhan alive, Kenneth Regan. Regan portrayed Anil as a man under financial pressure. He suggested Chauhan was involved in shady dealings and had no choice but to walk away from his life. But detectives weren't persuaded. Using mobile phone analysis, they reconstructed the movements of both men on the day Anil vanished. Chauhan's phone was first active in the Hounslow area. Then it traveled toward Stonehenge. Regan lived nearby, in Wilton, just outside Salisbury. What investigators saw next changed everything. The 2 phones met. From that point on, they traveled together heading southwest, deeper into the West Country, toward Exeter. Devon. The only known connection to Devon was the new managing director of CIBA Freight, Belinda Bruin. Detectives decided to visit her. When Regan learned the police were planning to come to Belinda's house, he panicked. He urged her not to let them in. Told her they'd only cause trouble, pressured her to cancel and meet them elsewhere. Belinda found the request unsettling. There was no reason to refuse the police unless there was something to hide. Later that same day, DCI Rowell received an unexpected call. It came from one of Regan's associates, William Hornsey. Hornsey claimed he had spoken to Anil Chauhan recently. He said Chauhan was still in the UK and on the run. He told police there was a plan to meet Chauhan near the passport office in Newport, Wales. According to Hornsey, he was supposed to provide stolen passports. In effect, he was offering to hand Chauhan over. Shortly afterward, Belinda received a call from the police. The visit to her home was canceled. They said they had new information and wouldn't need to see her. Regan called her almost immediately. He already knew. He told her the police were heading to Wales to arrest Anil Chauhan. And just like that, the pressure lifted. The supposed meeting with Chauhan was set for Easter Monday. But over the weekend, Regan arrived at Belinda's property again, this time with Hornsey and another associate, Peter Reese. Regan said he wanted to work on the lane by her stables. It genuinely needed graveling. When a digger appeared, Belinda thought nothing of it. She took her children into town and left them to it. 2 days later, detectives went to Newport. They positioned themselves near a bronze pig statue outside the passport office, the agreed meeting point. Regan and Hornsey arrived together. They waited, then pretended to receive calls, texts. Their body language changed. Frustration, irritation. Something clearly hadn't gone to plan. They told police they'd been warned off. Someone had called to say the police had been informed. The deal was canceled. Anil Chauhan, they said, wasn't coming. By now, investigators were certain of one thing. This wasn't a disappearance. It was a performance. And somewhere beneath it, buried carefully, was the truth they hadn't uncovered yet. Police traced the calls made in Newport, but they led nowhere. An unregistered phone. Whoever had orchestrated the meeting had vanished into thin air. It was clear now. The police hadn't been close to finding Anil Chauhan at all. They'd been sent on a deliberate detour. While Reagan returned to work at CBA Freight as if nothing had happened, detectives went back to their original plan. They called Belinda Bruin in for questioning. Detective Inspector Rowell told her he wanted a full and honest conversation. As Belinda was leaving for the interview, Reagan pulled her aside. He told her that if the police asked what he'd been doing on her land, she should say he'd been helping with her water system. Belinda found it strange. He'd mentioned looking at it, but no work had actually been done. It felt rehearsed, defensive. When police asked her what she thought had happened to Anil Chauhan, she said she didn't know. She told them everything she could. Then they asked if anything else felt odd. Belinda hesitated, then told them about Reagan's request, about the water system, about the digging. She explained that he hadn't worked on any pipes at all. He dug a drainage ditch. The reaction in the room was immediate. Detectives exchanged looks. He did what? Within hours, police were on their way to Devon. They were convinced they were about to uncover something terrible. The dig site in Belinda's field was carefully exhumed. Forensic archaeologists and pathologists worked inch by inch, examining the soil with painstaking precision. For 5 days, the murder squad searched the field, but the bodies they expected to find weren't there. By April 2003, the investigation had been running for more than 2 months. And the truth was, police had been looking in the wrong place. On a calm evening off the Dorset coast, 2 men went canoeing. The sea was quiet, the weather mild. They paddled farther out than usual, enjoying the stillness. Then one of them noticed something floating in the water. At first it didn't register, just shapes, debris maybe, until one of them said the word out loud, body. As they approached, there was no doubt. A large body floated face down in the water, inflated, motionless. Emergency services were called. One of the men stayed with the body in the darkness for nearly 3 hours, waiting, watching, unable to look away. The image stayed with him. The body was taken to a mortuary in Bournemouth. Nearly a week passed before identification was confirmed. It was Anil Chauhan. Those who knew him went to see him. They could tell immediately this was not a peaceful death. The post-mortem revealed a blow to the back of his head. Tape had been wrapped around his mouth. The cause of death was a combination of head injury and suffocation. Anil Chauhan had been murdered. As his clothes were examined for forensic evidence, detectives continued searching Belinda's field. This time, they found what they'd missed before: burnt clothing, jewelry, hair. The hairs were later identified as Anil's. The picture finally became clear. Anil had been killed. His body had been buried in Devon. Then, at a later point, it had been dug up, transported by boat, and dumped into the sea near Bournemouth. For those who worked at CBA Freight, the discovery ended all hope. They had believed quietly that Anil might one day return, that he'd walk back through the door, business or no business. Finding his body made that impossible. But the case wasn't over. Now that they knew what had happened to Anil, a far more terrifying question remained. What had happened to Nancy? And the children? And Anil's mother? The size of the dig site told its own story. It was far larger than anything needed to conceal a single body. And when investigators considered that scale alongside the disappearance of the entire family, the implications were chilling. There had been a bonfire at the site. Jewelry was recovered, believed to belong to Nancy. Small plastic fasteners were found too, the kind used on infant clothing. Taken together, the evidence pointed in only one direction. Police believed the entire family had been buried there. From that moment on, the investigation changed completely. It was reclassified as a Category A murder inquiry, the highest level, and Kenneth Regan moved from suspect to focus. By then, Regan's whereabouts were unknown. William Hornsey was also missing. Both men were on the run. Belinda was overwhelmed by what was unfolding. The idea that bodies may have been buried in her field was almost impossible to process. She tried to keep herself occupied, distracted, busy. While tending to her horse, she noticed its blanket was torn. She removed it, put it in her car, and drove up the lane to return it. That's when she saw them. Reagan and Hornsey. They were sitting in a car. Reagan lowered the window and said they needed to talk. Hornsey suggested she get in so they could go for coffee. Belinda refused. She made an excuse, said she had to return the blanket to a nearby cottage, told them she'd be back in 2 minutes. They agreed. Belinda drove around the corner and immediately called the police. Detective Inspector Rowell was direct. Whatever she did, she was not to get in that car. Officers were dispatched, but by the time they arrived, Reagan and Hornsey were gone. They fled to Europe, leaving one man behind, Peter Reese. Alone and no longer protected, Reese began to unravel. Staying at a boarding house, he confided in a fellow lodger, Wendy Powles. Within hours of arriving, he began talking too much. He said he'd been on television, that he was connected to a missing family, that police could place him at a burial site. He insisted he hadn't killed anyone. Then he said something that made Wendy freeze. He said Reagan had killed the children, that Reagan had killed all of them. Wendy didn't hesitate. She contacted the police. 12 days after going on the run, Peter Reese was arrested at a local pub. Despite what he had told Wendy, Reese refused to cooperate. He answered no questions. And the fate of the rest of the Chauhan family remained unknown. 3 weeks later, another body was found floating in the Solent. It was Nancy Chauhan. Her brother insisted on seeing her. Despite the condition of her body, he needed to say goodbye. To him, she was still his little sister. He spoke to her, apologized, told her he had tried to save her. It was the last time. Kenneth Regan was finally tracked down in Belgium after 2 months on the run. 6 weeks later, William Hornsey surrendered himself to police. But the darkest part of the story, the fate of the children, had yet to be fully revealed. All 3 prime suspects were now in custody, and all 3 refused to answer a single question. With 3 members of the family still missing, no witnesses, and no crime scene that told a clear story, police were left with a problem. They needed proof. Hard evidence that could link these men, not just to Anil Chauhan's murder, but to the destruction of an entire family. What they didn't yet realize was that the crucial clue they needed had already been left behind by Anil Chauhan himself. In April 2005, the case reached court. It marked the beginning of the longest criminal trial in the history of the Old Bailey. Prosecutors set out to prove that Kenneth Regan, William Hornsey, and Peter Reese had abducted and murdered all 5 members of the Chauhan family. Over 9 months, the jury was presented with nearly 4,500 exhibits, bank records, fuel receipts, paperwork tracing the slow dismantling of Anil's life. But the foundation of the case rested on one thing above all else: mobile phone evidence. By this point, investigators believed they understood exactly what had happened and who was responsible. Phone tracking placed Anil Chauhan in the company of Regan, Hornsey, and Reese. Together, their movements led back to Wilton in Salisbury, to a small bungalow, number 3 Forge Close, Kenneth Regan's home. During the critical window after Anil disappeared, there was never a moment when at least one of those phones was not in that area. Investigators believed Anil was being held there guarded, but knowing wasn't enough. They needed to show the jury exactly how Regan had pulled off the deception that followed. Then, unexpectedly, a breakthrough came from within the suspect's own family. William Hornsey's son contacted police. He handed over a color printer and a gray suitcase. Inside were sheets of A4 paper, each one bearing Anil Chauhan's signature. The discovery explained everything. Police now understood how Regan had convinced Saibe's staff that Anil had sold the company and vanished willingly. The theory was chilling. Anil had been held at Forge Close and forced under threat to sign blank documents. The suitcase contained 10 spare sheets, pre-signed pages, insurance for Regan, tools for further forgery if needed. Investigators believed Regan's original plan was simple: remove Anil Chauhan from the picture. But once he crossed that line, there was no way back. Nancy would have raised the alarm. So the plan expanded. Phone evidence showed that while Peter Reese remained in Salisbury, Regan and Hornsey traveled to Hounslow, to the family home. They stayed for hours. Police could not say with certainty what happened inside that house, only that the family disappeared that day. To detectives, it was clear. For Regan, these murders were not crimes of passion. They were steps. Necessary actions to get what he wanted, as routine as changing clothes. Police believed Anil Chauhan had been killed at Regan's bungalow, but proving it was another matter. A full forensic examination of Forge Close revealed almost nothing. The rooms had been redecorated, carpets removed, furniture replaced. Everything about the property suggested a deliberate attempt to erase evidence, but suspicion alone would not secure convictions. The case hinged on a single extraordinary piece of proof. Something small, something overlooked, an item collected at post-mortem, then forgotten in storage for nearly 8 months. A clue Anil Chauhan had carried with him to the very end. It was a sock, the right sock taken from his body, and inside it was the evidence that would finally speak for him. At first, the sock didn't seem important. Normally, socks carry very little evidential value. But for completeness, investigators decided to send the remaining items of clothing for further examination. When the scientists carefully unpackaged the sock, something unexpected fell out. A folded piece of paper. It was fragile, water-damaged, clearly exposed to seawater. But the way it had been folded over and over had protected it. It was a letter from the Cheltenham and Gloucester Building Society, addressed to Kenneth Regan, number 3 Forge Close. The date on the letter was February 12, 2003, the very day police believed Anil Chauhan was being held captive inside Regan's bungalow. In that moment, everything locked into place. To hide that letter inside his sock, Anil must have known what was coming. He must have understood that he was facing imminent death. This was not an accident. It was a message, a final act of defiance, meant to speak when he no longer could. For investigators, it was overwhelming. Proof that Anil Chauhan had been imprisoned at Forge Close. Proof of who had held him there. Proof sent from beyond the grave. After 9 months of evidence, testimony, and reconstruction, the jury returned a unanimous verdict. Peter Rees was sentenced to 23 years for the murder of Anil Chauhan. Kenneth Regan and William Hornsey were each given 5 consecutive life sentences for the murder of the Chauhan family. They will never be released. The remains of Anil's mother-in-law, Charanjit Kaur, were later recovered off the coast of the Isle of Wight. But the bodies of the 2 children, 18-month-old Devender and 8-week-old Ravender, were never found. For detectives, the motive made the crime even harder to accept. This wasn't desperation. It wasn't mental illness. It wasn't loss of control. It was greed, pure calculated self-gain. For Onkar, the questions never stopped. Who was killed first? What Nancy saw? What his mother saw? Whether the children were taken last? The answers were unbearable and unknowable. Onkar eventually returned to New Zealand. He would never meet his sister's children. The only time he ever saw the family together was on a video he found in their empty home. It had been filmed just 2 days before they disappeared. In it, the house is full of life. The children play. The elder son takes his first steps. His mother laughs. Nancy smiles. For Onkar, that video became everything. Proof that his sister was happy, that she was loved, that for a brief moment before everything was taken, they had been a family alive, together, and unaware of what was coming. And every time he closes his eyes, he still sees Nancy smiling, as if she's waiting for him to come home. If this case held your attention, support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. It helps keep these stories coming. Thank you for watching.